Hello everyone, this is Tom Uren. I'm here with the Grugq. G'day Grugq, how are you?
G'day Tom, I'm fine, and yourself?
I'm well. Welcome to another episode of Between Two Nerds. This week's edition is sponsored by Portswigger, who make the Burp suite of software products that, what are they? Network testing?
Web app testing, yeah. Good stuff.
There you go. So, there's a couple of interesting reports this week, and the overall arc of what we're going to talk about is the breakdown of norms in cyberspace in terms of there's operations going on that would have been unthinkable 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So we're going to start. Sentinel-1 produced this report of something that dates back to 2005, which is this Fast16.
Which is only a couple of years ago, if you think about it.
Fast16 malware, they called it. And the background is that it was actually leaked in shadow brokers, so quite a long time ago, but no one really understood what was going on. No one did a technical deep dive, or I don't really understand why it was not examined beforehand, but they've produced this report.
Well, I mean, there was a string that said, this is a signature, Fast16, and if you see it, ignore it.
Ah, right. Yes.
That's not a lot to go on.
Yeah, actually, I do remember now. Sentinel-1 had this process for finding the malware that was quite interesting. Like it looked like good work. We won't dive into it because
that's not our interest.
That's what we're talking about. But they found this malware, and the really super fascinating thing is that it seems like the only thing it did was change the results of particular types of engineering software that do advanced calculations.
So what would that be useful for? Because,
and so
I mean, are they trying to make it so that Quake runs very poorly? Are they interrupt
So it seems that it was targeted at the Iranian nuclear program. The interesting thing is it happened 5 years before Stuxnet, and it was changing the results of an engineering program is an entirely different thing from making centrifuges break themselves apart, which is what Stuxnet did. It's too elegant and too clever in a way. Yeah. To me, it felt like what is it? An elegant weapon from a more civilized time.
Yeah, like it's the sort of thing which I think at the time was how people viewed the use of cyber, is that it would be risky to go too aggressive and too far because you were inviting too much chaos. So you had to do something subtle that, would not escalate. Like it wasn't escalatory and it wouldn't trigger a response. It would be this like clever little...
Yeah. I really liked the idea. Like it's really attractive to me in that it's an invisible way of getting an advantage, but it almost feels like it's too clever and too invisible. And so from justifying an operation, it's like, well, we made their calculators give very, very slightly wrong answers.
we made high values of infinity appear to be low values of infinity. Yeah, they'll never notice it, but their yields will be way off. Yeah, it's the sort of thing that's going to be very hard to get budget for in year 2. It feels like, right? Like you could say like, yeah, we've got a plan to interfere with their nuclear program. We need millions. Here you go. And then year 2, you're like, okay, it's going really well. What we've done is we've erased the numbers on the digits of their calculators. So when they key things in, they don't know which numbers they're hitting. It's going to throw them back years, right? It just it seems like a hard sell.
Occurred to me is that this emphasizes how much resources go into it, because I really like the idea of changing those calculations, but to do it right, you've got to come up with numbers that are both plausible but also have, I guess, a significant impact.
Yeah, they have to be right enough to pass sort of the gut tests and the inspections of someone who knows what they should be looking for, but wrong enough that when they use them, it doesn't work. And it has to do that consistently no matter what they do, right? So if they change parameters, it still has to produce the wrong results in a way that's plausible. Like if they, I don't know, if they fat finger something and they put in 100 instead of 10, it shouldn't make the error margin so big that it suddenly appears evident to them. Like, this is way off.
Yeah. So this struck me as it's not something that a clever group of programmers are just coming up with by themselves. They'd have a team behind them to say what is the plan and what's it going to achieve and why is that in our interest.
Right. You'd need people who actually use the software to do not use the software, but who do the calculations for real, who could then say, if I was getting these results, they would look right to me, but when I put them into whatever, it just wouldn't work. So you need to figure out a way to get this to produce that. And the way I would do it using like these equations would be whatever. Like, so that's the sort of thing that NSA would be able to do, and I don't know who else would.
Yeah. So 5 years before Stuxnet, I presume, I'm kind of guessing it worked for some time, and then
I would think it would work longer than Stuxnet because it would be harder to detect.
There's so many unknowables, right? So the idea was it would get deployed to a facility and it had some self-propagation capability so that all the same software in a facility would give you the same answers. Mm-hmm. But, the people work in a different facility, yada, 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 yada. But that seems like a snapshot from a time where people would go, okay, we want an invisible effect that will have an impact. Right. Whereas nowadays, so the next story we're going to talk about, Kim Zeta has a report on her site, which is 0 Day, about a wiper that affected the Venezuelan state oil company, which I think is PDVSA. Is that the right acronym?
Yes. Yep.
And so the story there is that before Maduro was nabbed, the US was seizing oil tankers, Venezuelan oil tankers, and at the same time there was a wiper attack on the state oil company. Mm-hmm. And there's not a lot of evidence that positively does anything like confirm it was the US, but there doesn't seem to be any other reasons. And it also seems entirely plausible. So we've gone from this invisible...
Right, this very subtle, like we've messed with their calculations so they get the wrong answer,
we'll just wipe it.
Yeah.
And you, when we were talking before, you almost seemed disappointed or dismayed by the drop in standards.
Yeah, very much so. Like you sort of look at this and it's like very early on, it's like a welterweight boxer at the top of his game, who can do all this amazing footwork and these great punches and all this stuff, and it's just like it's artistry, and they're dancing around the ring. And then you come back a few years later, and they're no longer at the top of the game. They've slipped down to a different league. And they're doing underground fights or something, and like they're still good. They're still wiping the floor with guys, but it's like with Stuxnet, it's like okay, like it's impressive, but you sort of feel like anyone.
But where's
can
the
kind of
artistry?
Yeah, like it's sort of, it lacks that elegant subtlety of the earlier attack. And then just, 20 years later, you show up and he's outside a strip club as a bouncer. And
it's just like a wiper, just like the Russians.
Yeah, you're like, oh, this is what this is what the Russians do. You're better than this, man. Get yourself together.
Yeah, so my feeling was I was not at all surprised. Like, we don't know for sure. I would expect that it actually is the US.
If there was a polymarket bet on it, I would take the yes, it was the US.
And part of the reason is that they'd already shifted what they were prepared to do. So they were seizing tankers. I mean, they went and seized the president, right?
Right.
And so it seems like launching a wiper is behind the line of, they've moved the line and this is still behind.
Yeah, to paraphrase a thing from Babe Nagy, which is that if you're in the seizing tankers business, you're in the wipers business.
Right, yeah.
Like, if you've discarded so many norms to the point that you're just seizing tankers on the high sea for the hell of it, essentially, I don't see why you'd be like, oh, but that's cyber. That's different. That's special. You're not allowed to. You're not allowed to destroy things there. That would be bad.
Yeah, it felt like a normalization to me. And like, to be fair, like they had a purpose, which was to coerce Venezuela. So whether you think that was a good purpose or not, it's aligned with a state goal, right?
Right. It's a little bit like NotPetya in that it makes sense from the state's point of view, but it's very different in terms of the impact, the scoping, and I would argue, though I think it's arguable, or it's at least debatable, the attack on the Venezuelan oil from the point of view of a state is a more legitimate attack than NotPetya would be from Russia trying to put pressure on Ukraine.
Right, yes. It seemed like it was better scoped, right?
Right.
And to me, if you're going to wipe, it's the scoping that makes...
It was better scoped, but it was also consistent with an end goal, right? Like the idea was to put pressure on to cause regime change or, to cause the leader to step down. It wasn't just like unleash the dogs and make them miserable or, just make it not fun for them. Make things bad, right? Like that was a state goal, but it's not aimed or directed at some sort of objective that makes sense.
Yeah, so another example that I was thinking about was ASD has come out and said a couple of times that they've affected cyber criminals. Mm-hmm. And I remember, I was in the office the day that the Minister for Cybersecurity announced that was going to be one of the roles of ASD, and he basically stood up in some press conference and said, we're going to change the legislation, and it's actually in the legislation that's one of their functions, is to go after cyber criminals. And we're like, oh my goodness, this is unthinkable. That's not what states don't do that with other criminals in other countries.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
And so that was, I think that was just under 10 years ago. And it feels like now it's like, this is like, why
if you didn't do that, it would be seen as sort of a misuse of state power. Like, why are we paying all this money to do this when you're not even making the barest minimum effort to protect citizens from these cyber attacks, which are causing so much disruption? What are you guys even doing?
I think there's a rational kind of justification in that if a host state is not going to do anything about it, what other tools do you have?
Right.
And plus the collateral damage, like the harm you're causing that host state, it's
you might be knocking off a lot of child sexual abuse imagery websites as well. So it's not so much collateral damage as collateral victories.
Yeah. So that seems like my reaction at the time was just, that's the way it used to be, rather than is, so
I don't even think you were wrong to think that. It's just.
Oh, I'm glad to hear I was right then and now.
Well, it's consistent. We are, no matter what we think, we appear to have been right. But certainly, at the time, that was beyond the norms of what people were expecting. It wasn't completely, but it was very much. It was certainly pushing the boundaries.
I think it was I don't recall that at the time there were other states who'd actually announced that. Maybe there were some that were doing it, and now there's quite a few who say that yes, we'll take action against criminals.
It's sort of, I think in most places it's just sort of taken for granted. You assume that that's going on. If you found out it wasn't, you'd be a bit surprised, right? If Germany came out and said, we're investing all this money to set up a big cyber force and it's not going to go after criminals at all, you'd be thinking you're doing it wrong. That's just not the way that you should use that. So I think times have changed. But on the other hand, if Germany came out and said, we're going to be deploying wipers against anyone we don't like to apply pressure on them, that would still be weird, right? Would.
Yeah. So to me, it doesn't feel like norms are being abandoned so much as the use of cyber power is sort of catching up in a way.
Being normalized, almost.
Yes.
I mean, so what that brings up to me is on the one hand, you could look at, like you had this very elegant invisible thing, then you had this elegant visible thing, and now you have this inelegant visible thing. Like, is it that norms are collapsing, or is it that cyber is maturing as a tool of the state? Right. So is it just more accepted to use it as a regular thing rather than some sort of special, like, special needs statecraft?
Yeah. I think there's both of those things are happening, but they're kind of independent. So when you say norms are collapsing, I think what has happened in some of the examples we've talked about is that the US is just more willing to exert state power in a coercive way. And like that's a thing that I think a lot of people would describe that as norm breaking. But at the same time, the use of cyber power has just been normalized. So I don't see that the cyber operations in Venezuela, for example, they're not, like I said, they're not beyond the pale. They're consistent with the rest of their actions. Like they don't stand out. I think the ASD example, same sort of thing. Like there was actually a public statement, this is what we're going to do. Post the action, there was actually a pretty public explanation. They went into detail about how they launched the operation or did the wiping while the alleged criminals were out drinking so that there would be the incident response would be less effective and be delayed because they're at the pub or whatever.
I've got to say, that seems like it's a pretty easy timing thing to do against a Russian hosting provider, to pick the time when they're drinking.
Yeah, so that's a kind of deliberate say it and then do it and then justify it. And that seems, at least in the Australian case, fair enough. I think the US has also, in recent times, spoken a lot about the cyber operations they've undertaken. So in Venezuela, they spoke publicly about, we did this electricity
we
lights
hit the
thing.
grid and we were so cool.
And then in Iran, we did this other thing, and details have leaked out. So it's once you're taking the kinetic action, the cyber is a supporting
wiping someone's
act.
If you're blowing up someone's house, wiping their router, sort of, it's not really on the scale at that point.
Yeah, right? That's right. Yeah. It's complementary. Yeah, so one other example that's happened recently is a Russian cryptocurrency exchange, Grugq. It had, I think it was $13 million equivalent. 13 to
stolen. 15, depending on which hour you checked.
And they claimed that they were as per usual, the victim of a sophisticated threat actor, but they actually blamed Western intelligence agencies.
Right. And so I'll be honest, when I started reading the report, there, like we got hacked, all this money was stolen, it happened quickly, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, this is Australia, right? Like these guys are linked to crypto scamming and ransomware. Australia sort of, they're getting more aggressive and more public about what they're doing. Must be them. And then the more I read, the less that made sense, right? So there are things like the money was laundered and sent through mixers and across chains and all this stuff. And that didn't seem right. I mean, my read on it is that if the Australians were going to hack a crypto exchange and steal the funds, they would either burn all the money, like just burn it so no one has it, or they would legally transfer it to a crypto wallet that would be government held, and they'd post a notice saying like your funds have been seized. Here's the legal process that you can launch to try and reclaim them. Come to Canberra and
it'd be done by the book as opposed to
right. It would be one of those two things, which is not what happened. Right?
Yeah. So Patrick asked me about this, and my first reaction was, no, I don't think it's the US or Five Eyes. And part of my thinking at the time, all of like a week ago, was that
in the before times, way back when.
That's right. Yeah. Before this podcast, there's a prohibition norm, I guess, against attacking financial institutions. So that's just something that
someone should tell the North Koreans that, I think.
And that's exactly what occurred to me, is that in fact the concern is that you would get some sort of global contagion and that it would affect the global financial system if a big bank were to get hacked.
I mean, even during World War II, none of the sides, like they could all print each other's money.
Right.
But none of them did it. Like there was the temptation to like just flood the other side with fake bills to crash their economy. And no one did it because the retaliation for doing the same thing would be so bad. So there's very much the like, okay, you can do it in small quantities to like pay spies or to, purchase stuff on the black market or whatever. But you're not like dropping millions and millions into their economy. And I think there was this, at least historically, there was a sense of like the financial systems are sort of out of bounds.
Sacrosanct. Yeah. Yeah. I know Carnegie did a financial, I think they called it FinCyber project. And then some of the people who worked there ended up working in the US administration. So there is a cross-pollination of ideas or whatever. But then it occurred to me afterwards that, well, like you said, North Korea has proven that you can go around pillaging the cryptocurrency ecosystem and it doesn't make any difference at all. People are still investing in it. And
I mean, they even tried to rip off a bank and it failed, but that hasn't impacted the financial sector in terms of loss of trust, right?
Yeah. So one of the other reasons I thought that the US might not be keen on that sort of thing is that the Trump administration is keen on cryptocurrency. But I'm not.
Yeah. So like what I would find would be more plausible was if the US did start hacking everywhere and stealing all the crypto, and then they put out a statement saying that it was sanctions against North Korea. So they were preemptively seizing all of the crypto that the North Koreans would steal. And it was being transferred to a wallet that would be administered by the Trump Corporation for the betterment of the US in some vague way. I could absolutely see that happening. It's not that they wouldn't do it because they'd be morally against it or it would be sort of outside the norms. It's just, it doesn't seem like the sort of thing that falls within the sort of operations that they consider useful, right? That they have these ideas of like, oh yeah, you deploy a wiper to apply pressure. You hack the communications to aid military. You turn off the grid to aid an operation. Like they're very sort of direct action oriented. They're very much like, do this thing to achieve this objective right now. Not so much.
Right. Yeah.
Not so much change the outputs of a calculation program for,
Well, it strikes me that they've been incorporated into military operations, and military operations are not go steal money from a bank.
Well, it depends on the military, but yeah.
U.S. military operations.
Right.
Like that's not the, what military.
That's a private enterprise sort of thing. It's certainly not.
Yeah. But I was thinking that all these discussions about stealing money, either from banks, which I still would be extremely skeptical of ever happening, ever. In the next 3 months.
That one does seem like that one does seem beyond the pale. Not in the same way that like hacking criminals is like 10 years ago would have been like, whoa, that's quite aggressive. But hacking banks seems sort of like let the world burn kind of thing. Yeah, it's very much in the like just flood the market with fake money and see what happens because why not? Like it seems to be crossing a line where the impact on yourself is going to be so big that the benefit you get is not worth it. Yeah.
So I think it was it during the 12-day war where Iran and Israel were fighting, there was a cryptocurrency exchange, an Iranian cryptocurrency exchange. I think it was Nobitex was wiped. And it's like, it would not surprise me if a crypto exchange in Iran was wiped these days by either Israel or the US. That seems plausible. So it seems like that sort of action is at least conceivable. And so there still seems to be a norm against, at least in our mind, against banks, like traditional banks.
So during like the 12-day war, if it came out that one of the banks got wiped, I'd find it a bit surprising, but I also...
Well, didn't one of them get wiped? Was it Bank Sapar?
I think so.
Yeah.
Like, Yeah. Like, I'd find it a little bit surprising, but sort of just in that, like, do you really want the Iranians to think it's okay to do this? Because at some point they will have the capability. Right.
So you think that was a mistake then, looking back? Because I remember now that there was one that was wiped as well as
I'm not sure if it's
crypto
a mistake. I'm not sure that the benefit that you get from it is worth having crossed that line.
Right. So not necessarily a mistake, but definitely risky.
Like, it's inviting a world of hurt, and I'm not sure that it's worth it. Like, if you're an advanced state with an advanced economy and complex financial instruments and all this stuff, and you go after a significantly less developed place and make it okay to go after financial systems, I think you're more exposed and more vulnerable than they are. And it's not necessarily a good idea to say that these things are now okay and in scope. Like, that's just my feeling. It's like, I think that the vulnerability is disproportionately asymmetrical. Mm-hmm. And so inviting retaliation across that is putting yourself at more risk than you could possibly inflict on them.
Right.
But that's also several orders of, like, layered thinking of, like, in 10 years, will you have wanted to do, like, will you look back and regret that you did this? Maybe. And I'm not sure that that might not be a good timeline for these things that arise.
It also seems to me there's a really very large difference between, like North Korea or Israel going after a bank and the US going after a bank. Like, it's not the Israeli shekel that is the world's reserve currency. Like, you look at North Korea and it's just been tremendously, like, successful. And so there's a strong argument there that if North Korea can do it, maybe Australia can do it. I'm not seriously suggesting that. But I think there is a significant difference between North Korea, a country the size of Australia with the capacity that it has, and a country like the US or China doing it. Right. I think you can fiddle around the margins, which is what North Korea is doing.
Yeah,
and
if you're like a tier 1 state, things that you do have a bigger impact overall than if you're like a tier 2, like Australia or whatever, and then tier 70, like, or tier, 182, like North Korea or whatever.
Yeah. And I think if it was known that China was trying to seriously damage the global financial system, I think that, like, that's a significantly different problem. And I suppose, but the thing is that those countries, the US and China, they already have conventional, particularly the US, already have conventional tools that they can swing their weight around. So there's kind of no need to do the cyber thing. Right. So the US has got sanctions.
It solves a problem they don't have.
Yeah.
Yeah. If the US wants to raise 15 million quickly, they're not going to hack a crypto exchange in Kazakhstan. Oh, here's a question. So if we're doing wipers now, do you think that means we don't do FAST16 operations anymore? Has one replaced the other, or has the toolkit expanded, or has it been replaced?
I mean, I would like to think it's been expanded, because just the idea of that operation, something very, very clever that's almost invisible, like that just appeals innately to me. I think maybe that Stuxnet occurred indicates that there were limitations that made it hard to either know that it was successful. Like, how do you... Right. Like, you may know that the malware is there.
Yeah. How do you measure that their thinking is wrong?
Yeah, that's right. Until, like, my kind of conception was when they try and actually blow up the bomb, it doesn't work. You're right. But if they're not actually trying to do a nuclear test, how do you ever know? Like, it's unmeasurable whether you've succeeded or not. Whereas it seems like you would get more signal about whether Stuxnet had been successful from other sources, like they're buying more centrifuge tubes or something.
Right.
So it could be like a measurement problem where, did it work? I don't know.
It's hard to get promoted for an invisible operation that you can't see whether it worked or not.
Yes.
Like that's not the sort of thing that you put in your promotion packet of, like, this last year went really well. I did something.
We did something.
We did something that no one knows about, and you can't see if it worked or not. And it cost a huge amount of money. And
but we're all very convinced it was very, very clever.
Yeah, it seems like it should work. Yeah.
That actually is one possibility, that you don't know whether they're actually successfully being led down the garden path or not. And so
Right.
the lesson from even a successful operation might be, we need to do something where we get some signal back,
Right.
some indicator of success.
Some sort of feedback of any sort other than...
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely, that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think those types of very clever operations, they depend so much on the particulars that it's hard to sit back here, 20 years later, and come up with alternative scenarios. Like, they're all hypothetical scenarios until you're actually in a concrete situation.
Yeah, I think actually there'd be more scope for that sort of the Fast 16 style attack these days, because there's just more vulnerable landscape that you can impact. But I wonder if sort of the problem of, how do you prove that you've done anything is going to be an issue. Because, something that we bring up a lot is that, like, the state organizations that are doing these things are institutions, right? Like, they're bureaucracies. They have people in them. There's promotion paths. There's people who go on vacation. There's, petty kingdom building. There's all of that stuff going on. So even if hypothetically you can come up with this like brilliant, clever attack, unless it fits within that institution's ability to conceive of it and for someone to promote it and take responsibility and push it through, like, it's not really going to happen. And I think that a completely invisible operation, it's going to be a tough sell, because you're going to throw a lot of political capital on something that is unlikely to benefit you.
I think it is problematic. Yeah, I agree that it's problematic for that reason, because of the subtlety. It's too subtle for bureaucracy.
It's here we go. It is the anti between two nerds operation. Thanks a lot, Tom.
Thanks, Grugq.